Welcome back to another unbelievably interesting lecture on online economics and macro topics. In the previous lecture, we were introducing some macroeconomic relationships, and we talked about the relationship between disposable income, consumption, and savings. And disposable income is our after-tax income. Right? Consumption, durable goods, non-durable goods, and services that individuals or households buy. Obviously, savings is postponed consumption, right? So you put your money in a bank or a certificate of deposit, or you buy a stock or whatever you buy, right? So we talked about those three relationships, and it was important to understand the ideas of average propensity to consume and average propensity to save, right? So in other words, if you made $50,000 a year, we said if you spent 40 of the 50, your average propensity to consume was 0.8 or 80%. Your average propensity to save was 0.2 or 20%. And we talked about marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. So when your income changes, what percentage of your change in income do you spend, and what percentage of that change in income do you save, right? So from this idea of income, John Maynard Keynes builds his macroeconomic model of the world. So here we have what's called the consumption function, right? Now the good news for our class, this macroeconomics class, this is not the model of gross domestic product, of aggregate output, and of the big picture, say macroeconomic equilibrium GDP that we're going to use, right? And I'll explain why in a moment. But this was one of Keynes's major contributions to economic thinking. So what do we have measured here? On the vertical axis, we have in billions of dollars the level of consumption, and on the horizontal axis, the level of income. Keynes asked and answered a very simple question. He said, if you want to know an economy's level of economic activity, level of output, he said, well, all you need to know is its level of income. In other words, the level of economic activity, the level of GDP which takes place is closely related to the level of income generated within that society. So the greater the income, the more GDP, right? So this 45-degree line going through this graph up top here, at every point on that line, consumption equals income, right? So that on that diagonal. So then he just draws this function through it, this blue function, right? The consumption schedule. And he said, okay, assuming that we spend a certain percentage of our income, right, where the consumption schedule intersects with the 45-degree line, that gives you your society's level of aggregate output, right, or GDP. Right. Matter of fact, if you wanted to get really technical, and this is something you absolutely positively don't need to know for this course, but if you're taking an advanced macroeconomics course, something you may discuss, the slope of the consumption function is actually equal to the marginal propensity to consume. Right? It's a little technical there, but it's an interesting statistic. Right? Now, as much as Keynes contributed to macroeconomic thinking, and as powerful as some of his ideas have been for formulating things like fiscal policy since the Great Depression and World War II era, his model of the economy had a major flaw, right? And that is it's a stagnant price model. In other words, the problem with this model is that it doesn't tell us or give us any insight into the pricing in the economy, right? But it does get us thinking. So we're going to move on from this model. Right? This is going to be the last we speak of it. There's actually no quiz questions on this particular model because we're going to cover in detail what's called the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model in a future chapter. Okay, so here is an important idea that Keynes did add to economic thinking, and this is the idea of what's called a multiplier, right? So before we start looking at this tabular example of the multiplier, let me just explain in simplest terms what is the multiplier, right? So if I stroll into any store today and I spend $1,000, right, there's an increase in spending of $1,000 in the economy. Now, sometimes students get confused and say, okay, is it a change in spending or is it a change in income? Well, remember, spending and income are two sides of the very same coin. In other words, when I spend money, it's an expenditure. Right? To the business's standpoint, it's income. Right? So it's $1,000 increase in spending or $1,000 increase in income for the business. Now, remember, we said when we measure GDP, we actually explained those two different sides of the same coin. We said there's two ways to measure gross domestic product, either by adding up all the monies that was spent on final goods and services, or the income generated from those very same goods and services, right? So I stroll into this store and I spend $1,000. I go, well, what's the cumulative impact or effect on GDP? Well, now the store has $1,000 increase in income, and just for simplicity, let's assume it's a sole proprietor. I said this woman running the store, she now has an increase in income of $1,000. Right, the question is, right, how much of that thousand will she spend? Right, and then so let's assume that she's going to spend 75% of that thousand. Right, well then, all right. So first there's an increase in economic activity of 1,000, and then 75% of that, which is 750. Right, and then well the next store, the next business, they're going to spend 75% of that. Right, so the idea here is the multiplied effect, where the cumulative impact of changes in spending when there's an initial change in income slash spending, right? So this is one of the major contributions of Keynes to the macroeconomic thinking. Now, we've been talking about it in a positive manner, but we're going to actually go through some examples where there can be actually a decline in spending and how it causes a cumulative decline in income slash GDP, right? So here we say, okay, we start off with $5. Right, $5, and that could be 500, 5 billion, right, 5 million. Doesn't really matter. But Keynes said, okay, assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. Right, so any change in income, right, you're going to spend 75% of that change in income, and then obviously the marginal propensity to save needs to be 25, right, because those two have to add up to 1. So that in this economy, first there's an initial increase of 5, right? So you see that as round 1. Well then, okay, what's the next round? Well, it's going to be 75% or 5 or 375, right? So you see an increase in spending in the second round, right, of another $3.75 or 3.75 billion, whatever the case may be. So now it's similar to the example I was going over earlier with $1,000, except now we're doing it with $5, right? So someone goes in the store, they spend $5, and then the next person spends 75% of that, which is 375, and then 75% of that, which happens to be 281, right? And then 75% of that, which happens to be $2.11. And now you can see that the cumulative impact on GDP is much larger than the initial change of $5, the initial increase in income slash spending of $5, right? And they go through this whole process, like round by round, first round, second round, third round, fourth round, fifth round, all other rounds, and they say, okay, in total, the initial change in income of $5, right, ended up having a $20 increase, or a $20 total change, creating a $20 change in GDP, in gross domestic product, right? Now, it would be extremely tedious, and most macro students, introductory macro students, would probably dislike me even greater than they do now, making you do all this homework and learn all this stuff. Hopefully, you're finding some of it interesting. But imagine if I made you do this, said, okay, there's an initial change in spending of, say, $200, and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. So do 75%. Well, it would become extremely tedious to do that time after time. Say, okay, round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4. Isn't there an easier way to calculate what the cumulative effect of a change in spending or income will be if we know the marginal propensity to consume? Well, that's what we use here. We can calculate what's called the multiplier, right? So if we know the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save, we can calculate the multiplier. So there's two formulas to calculate the multiplier, and they would each work as well, right? So neither one of these works any better. If you know the marginal propensity to consume, so in the previous example it was 0.75, the multiplier is calculated by saying 1 over 1 minus 0.75, right? So that's 1 over 0.25, so 1 divided by 0.25 is 4, right? So then let me go over that math one more time, right? On the previous slide, in the example, the marginal propensity to consume was 0.75, so we simply plug that into the first formula here. Right, so 1 divided by 1 over 0.75, or 1 over 0.25, works out to be 4. Now, two things. Number one, the multiplier is not the marginal propensity to consume. Right? Often students, they see the marginal propensity to consume, and they're like very excited, and they forget that the marginal propensity to consume tells us, okay, of our change in income, what percentage of that change in income will we spend, right, on average? We can use the marginal propensity to consume to calculate the multiplier, right? So that's the first important idea. Make sure you notice these two economic concepts are not the same thing. The multiplier is not the marginal propensity to consume. The marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save can be used to calculate the multiplier, right? So the multiplier is the economic concept of, okay, when there's an initial change in spending or income, what's the cumulative impact overall total change that it's going to create for GDP? Now, in the previous example, we did the tedious method. We took $5 and then 75% of that, and 75% of that, and 75% of that, and we finally came out that the total change was $20. Total increase in GDP was $20. Well, let's just use what we've learned and plug this into our formula and show you how this works. All right, so we already calculated that if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, our multiplier is 4. Right? All you have to do is take that 4, the multiplier we just calculated, times the initial change in income, right? On the previous slide that was 5. 4 times 5, we get the same answer, 20, right? Now you understand what we mean by the multiplier, right? And how it can be used to calculate the total change in GDP given an initial change in spending. Right? Real quick, I'll just comment on the formula at the bottom of the slide here. If you're given the marginal propensity to save, you can equally or easily as well calculate the multiplier. Right? The marginal propensity to save can be plugged into forms like 1 over 0.25, right, is 4. Right? So 4 is our multiplier again. 4 times that change of 5 in the previous slide, come up with the same answer. Right? So on the next slide here, right, this is a good slide for two reasons. Number one, it allows students to quickly calculate the multiplier without really doing any math, right? So if you ever have this slide, if you ever have to calculate a multiplier, just come back to this slide and say, okay, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5, 0.67, 0.75, 0.8, 0.9, you'll know automatically what the multiplier is, right? So you can, I know it's not that difficult to take 1 over 1 minus this marginal propensity to consume to calculate the multiplier, right? But this is a nice, a handy dandy, guide here to, right? But more importantly, here's the economic rationale or concept associated with this particular slide, right? The larger the marginal propensity to consume, the greater the size of the multiplier, right? And this should make sense intuitively. So if you think about it, okay, the marginal propensity to consume tells us what percentage of our change in income will be spent, right? So a higher marginal propensity to consume means there's going to be a higher or a greater multiplied effect when we're given a change in income slash spending, right? So if people on average spend 75% of their additional income, right, the multiplier works out to be 4, right? If people spend 80% of their additional income, the multiplier is 5, right? And obviously, if they spend 90% of their change in income and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, the multiplier is 10. So the larger the size of the marginal propensity to consume, right, the larger the size of the multiplier. Now, it's not on this slide, but it's worth mentioning. The smaller the marginal propensity to save, the larger the size of the multiplier. Right? So the smaller the marginal propensity to save, the larger the size of the multiplier. All right, so in the previous slides, we introduced the concept of the multiplier. And we talked about how we can calculate the multiplier if we're given either the marginal propensity to consume or the marginal propensity to save, right? So here we have algebraically expressed a good system to explain how the multiplier has practical application to our understanding of GDP and the macroeconomy, right? So up top is the algebraic expression that the book offers, is that the multiplier equals the change in real GDP over the initial change in spending, right? And that's all well and good, but I think a better way to explain this, and all I did was do some algebraic manipulation here, was say, okay, if we know the initial change in spending, right, and we times that or we multiply that by the multiplier, right, that'll give us our total change in GDP. So I think a much more powerful and practical way to express this for students is the second equation I have up there. And this is important because or it's very useful, at least for students, because if you're given the multiplier and you know the initial change in spending, you can calculate the total GDP, right? Or likewise, if you're given the total change in GDP, right, and the initial change in spending, you can calculate the multiplier. Or if you're given any two of these three, it's easy to figure out the other one, so to speak, right? So let's look down bottom. I have an example here. I said let's assume that there's an increase or initial change in spending of 5 billion. Now, for the time being, let's say that gross business investments, so spending by businesses on machines, equipment, and tools, right? Because remember, that's investment spending. So ABC company, could be just one company, spent $5 billion on new machinery. The question is, when it's all said and done, what's the cumulative impact on the economy if there's an increase in spending of $5 billion on gross business investment on machines and tools and equipment? Well, let's assume that the multiplier here is 5, right? So in parentheses, I gave you the marginal propensity to consume. So how did we come up with that multiplier of 5? All right, so let's remember our formula. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume will give you the multiplier. So 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is 1 over 0.2, right? And 1 divided by 0.2 is 5, right? So that's where assuming that the marginal propensity to consume in this economy is 0.8, right? We can calculate the multiplier of 5. So if there's an initial increase in spending of 5 billion, right, times the multiplier of 5, there's a total impact or total increase in GDP, the total change in real output of $25 billion. So now you understand why investment spending is so powerful as a tool for economic activity. When businesses spend money on machines and equipment, they've obviously made an order to some other company for that equipment, and then they're going to hire people to run that equipment. So that's the contribution that John Maynard Keynes made to macroeconomic thinking. Right? Now, another way to evaluate or examine this same idea is say, what if the federal government, what if Uncle Sam, right? What if the president and the members of both houses, they say, okay, what if we need to kickstart economic activity? Now, this is referred to as fiscal policy. This is actually something we're going to cover in more detail in a later lecture, actually a later chapter. But it's never too early to introduce these ideas, right? So what if the government wants economic activity? What if they want GDP to increase by $25 billion, right? And let's assume that the government understands that the multiplier is roughly 5 in this economy. So we say, okay, how much government spending will it take to increase GDP by 25 billion? Well, obviously here the answer is 5, right? We have the numbers here. But now you understand the idea of government intervention into the macro economy when the economy falters, when we're in a recession. If the government spends money, right, they're going to get more bang for the buck because of this multiplied effect. So if the government increases spending on, say, roads and bridges by 5 billion, right, there's going to be a much greater impact on the economy, much greater impact on total GDP, right? The total change is going to be somewhere near $25 billion, assuming a multiplier of 5. Now, what the good Lord giveth, he also taketh away, right? So here we have an example of a drop in investment spending, right? So in the previous example, we talked about an increase in investment spending and what the total increase was on GDP. Now, obviously, put this in red with a negative sign in front of it. What if gross business investment for the first quarter in the United States falls by $15 billion, right? And let's assume that the multiplier here is 4, right? And again, I gave you the marginal propensity to save this time, right? So it's the same idea, just one of the different formula, right? Say we can calculate the multiplier by taking 1 over the marginal propensity to save, right? So 1 divided by 0.25 works out to be 4. I know obviously the marginal propensity to consume in this economy would be 0.75 because the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save always add up to 1, right? So assume the multiplier is 4, right? And we just showed you how to calculate that. If there's a drop or decrease in gross business investment, right, of $15 billion, then the economy will drop, or economic activity, the total change in GDP will be negative $60 billion, right? This was actually one of the most important and astounding contributions that Keynes made to macroeconomic thinking during the Great Depression. Right? He was the first one, or at least first one credited with, pointing out this idea of a multiplied impact on the economy. In other words, when gross business investment stopped, when companies across the country stopped buying new machines and equipment and tools and refurbishing factories, it didn't just stop there. Things got worse because then other companies lost orders, and then people were laid off, and then people who were laid off, they stopped spending. So the multiplied impact, the multiplied effect on the economy was much larger than the initial change in spending.